Hi everyone, how's everyone going? Really sorry for the wait. There's been just some technical difficulties with the webinar, but everything is sorted. Really appreciate everybody for patiently waiting. But today we've got a really exciting and super educational webinar where I'm joined by Joanna Kay, Joe, who is a partner at the family law department in Leicester Aldridge, where we're going to talk about, right, which is a great title, Love, Law, and Life After Marriage, Hoping for the Best, Plan for the Rest. So again, most people don't think about, family sort of matters from a legal perspective or from a financial perspective. And hopefully this webinar will just be some really good food for thought. And again, having a plan for the rest. So today's agenda, again, 4 very key topics, right, in the matter, from both the legal and the financial aspect of a divorce. Pre-nuptial agreements, post-nuptial agreements, and cohabitation agreements. Many of these agreements you might have seen on TV and think that they don't work, but in fact, as a matter of fact, which Joe will walk through with you, they do work here in the UK. There's just a few things you have to be careful about, and again, she'll walk you through these matters. So, as you can see, our email address and how to contact us on here. And as always, as a thank you for attending our webinars, we're always offering a complimentary consultation, right? So please do get in touch if you have any follow-on questions following this webinar, and we'd be happy to give you a bit of advice afterwards. So Fusion itself, we're a 360-degree advisory, right, where we cover all aspects of professional services. And joining us today, again, is Joe, who is the partner at Leicester Aldridge. Do you want to give a quick, introduction about yourself, Joe?
Yes, absolutely. Thanks, Chenji. So I'm a partner at Leicester Aldridge. We're a full-service law firm based in Bournemouth, Southampton, and London. And I'm a partner in the family department of the London office.
Fantastic. So let's dive straight in. Over to you, Mike. Over to you, Joe.
I'll start. Okay. So we thought it might be helpful to discuss how to preserve wealth in the context of personal relationships. From my point of view, there's two things to consider: cohabitees, which are non-married relationships, and marriages or civil partnerships. So we'll think about what happens to assets when those relationships end and how to mitigate the uncertainty. But to understand what we're mitigating against, we need to know how a court would approach division of assets on divorce. So very briefly, the English court has a very wide discretion, and they exercise that discretion to achieve a fair division of assets and income. England is seen as and particularly London, a favourable jurisdiction, particularly for the financially weaker party. So that's all well and good, but it does leave matters pretty uncertain when you're divorcing. The starting point of division of capital assets is, well, since the year 2000, it's been equality. So starting point, maybe not the finishing point, but the starting point of division of capital assets is 50-50 of assets acquired during the marriage. Now, inheritance and pre-acquired assets, so assets brought into the marriage, can be ring-fenced to the extent they're not needed to meet the couple's needs. But that is a very grey area, hence the uncertainty, and lots of factors will be taken into account. For example, were those assets mingled with the matrimonial assets, and to what extent? So clients are obviously keen to add some certainty into the mix, and that is why prenups and postnups are very popular at the moment.
Brilliant.
Do you want me to carry on, or do you want to chip in, Chenji?
No, please carry on.
Yeah.
I think, but overall, I think, going into the division of assets, how exactly does a divorce work in the UK, right? So before we even talk about the split of assets, right, how, when couples are thinking about getting a potential divorce, right, and every family dynamics is different, do we go through a mediation first? How do you make an application? How does that really process work?
Yeah, so there's different ways of proceeding with a divorce. And if we focus on not the divorce itself, which is quite a simple legal procedure, and not children, they're 2 separate conversations, but in terms of finances, there are different ways to do it, ranging from the couple sitting across the table and reaching an agreement themselves, to mediation, to instructing solicitors, and we can act in a variety of ways, with or without instituting court proceedings. So all these different routes have different implications in terms of how likely you are to exit the process fairly amicably, cost implications, etc. But there are different routes, and we do try and help matters proceed as amicably as possible.
Yeah, brilliant. And I mean, obviously, like, from a financial, I think there's two major parts of like a divorce, right? The division of assets from a financial perspective, and the if there are children involved, right?
Yes.
How do, I guess, how does that really happen? So, I mean, do you want to walk through a bit more about, the rest of your slide here, about the financial aspect, or, even the children's?
Yeah, so with the financial aspect, I should say that whichever route you take, be it you reach an agreement with or without solicitors, you should have the agreement drawn up into what's called a consent order. And that details the terms of the agreement. And crucially, it also dismisses the opportunity to come back and to claim again against each other or each other's estate. So if one of you were to die, the other can't come back against the estate and claim again. Children matters is the opposite, if you like, in that if the parents can reach an agreement, you don't have to go to court to have that put in an order. I mean, we'd recommend it's confirmed in writing, but the court doesn't have to ratify it.
Yeah. And I mean, I'm always super interested about, like, I think this point of view is, breadwinner versus homemaker, right? Because, again, in a traditional English household, right, it is still very much, a sort of, breadwinner versus homemaker kind of household. So how does the court come to a conclusion about, what to sort of, in the division of assets, who gets to own what? And, in your experience, So when we talk about the starting point in divorce, the starting point for division of capital assets being 50-50, I'm saying that it doesn't matter if you're the breadwinner or the homemaker in that situation. The starting point is an equal division, because the court thinks that the contribution each party has made to the marriage is of equal value, maybe not equal financial value, but equal value. Yeah.
And as I say, that's assets acquired during the marriage, the matrimonial pot, not necessarily inherited or pre-acquired assets.
Yeah. No, that's brilliant.
Yeah. And sorry, just on that point, it doesn't, just be clear, it doesn't matter if you're married in whose name the asset is legally held. Everything is put into the pot for division. Right.
Which is a really good segue to actually, like, again, the financial planning really in these type of divorce cases, right? So as we said, financial a financial settlement, right, is usually a big part of a divorce. But before you even get to that settlement stage, right, at the very start, there has to be like a disclosure that's being made, right? So I think, Joe, correct me if I'm, there's something called Form E. Yeah. So whereby, again, both parties in the divorce will disclose, what they actually own. Now, there are some types of assets that are very easy to value, things such as your property, things such as cash, and any publicly listed stocks and shares where you can easily see, like, as of today, this is how much all the shares are worth. But not every asset is easy to value, right? Because some people have businesses, right? These are private companies, which are, again, which the partner might not know how much it is worth. They might have investments. One of the spouses can have investments into private companies, right? So either private equity funds or venture capital funds, or even in the business, actually one of my mates is fish and chip shop, right? Who can value that, my share of that fish and chip shop. So these are all of the things that you should speak to a financial advisor about, and the lawyer actually, right? To see how can we actually, fairly value these holdings and these assets, and how do we actually get a share of that, right? And with all that information in mind, then we kind of go into the pre-settlement stage, where actually the legal team and the client's legal team and the financial team can look at the different types of assets and what are the tax treatments of these different types of assets. Because, and the classic example that I always use is pensions, right? Pensions is a very tax efficient type of asset, and it's outside of your estate for inheritance tax purposes. And again, every growth inside is actually tax-free. So what sometimes can happen is if you look at, sort of the long-term projection of, your pensions versus your other, like, say, for example, your properties, right? If you can give away a bit more of your property, which ultimately you'll have to pay, both capital gains tax on and inheritance tax on, and then keep a bit more of your pension where there is no inheritance tax and there is no capital gains tax, right? You could even create a win-win situation. So, I mean, I don't know if, if you had cases like this before where somebody chose to give away, like, say, a buy-to-let property, but then keep the whole pensions, right? Because I've done, a case, I've been involved in a case whereby it just made more sense from a long-term financial simulation perspective to give away a buy-to-let because that was going to be fully inside the spouse's estate, but then keeping the pension, which is outside of their estate. Both parties are going to be fine financially, but it just made more tax sense and creating a win-win situation.
Yeah, well, we look at the assets in Iran and we do get tax advice on potential settlements. And with regards to pensions, we can look at that as a capital asset, which they are, but also we often do pension sharing orders. And then each party ends up with their own pension, their respective income streams in retirement.
Absolutely. And again, with pension orders, sharing orders, that's a great again, topic. So once both parties have agreed to like a settlement, how the division of assets are going to be made, right? And that, the court has issued the order, make sure everybody is happy, then it's time to actually implement this, right? So a pension sharing order essentially cuts one of the spouse's pension in half, right? So obviously
half or whatever percentage has been agreed. Yeah. Exactly.
Now, the main owner, the owner of the original pension could just continue on with their existing pension provider and whatsoever. But then once, the remaining pension is carved out to the other, spouse, right, ex-spouse, right, that needs to actually go somewhere. And then that's kind of where we come in and look at the whole of market, right, to see like, what are the options for you? What kind of pension do you want? Do you actually need to dip in that money right now, in that pension money right now? Or is it something that, you may want to keep for the longer term because you have other assets to trickle you over, for your living, for your expenditures, and you might want to use it as an inheritance tax planning tool as well. Again, in the shorter term, there might be the remaining part that may have a lot of cash proceeds, and that should be managed in a good, in a good way because you can get a lot of interest, by keeping them in a short-term cash before deciding on the long-term financial planning aspect of it and see where you should be distributing that cash into based on your future goals. So, and again, I'm sure there will be questions about, sort of the questions about divorces. So, I mean, we'll be having we'll be spending quite some time in the Q&A section afterwards. So please, do have your questions ready, and then, we'll get to answer them afterwards. So moving on to a very interesting thing I've always wondered about, because ever since growing up, I'm watching these Hollywood movies and people mentioning prenups. But then now that we're adults, we actually wonder, so how does a prenup actually work? Do they work? Over to you, Jo.
You're right, Kendi. I think historically, and certainly when I started doing this about 20 years ago, it was more the rich and the famous going for prenups. But now, the inquiries we get are of that ilk as well, but couples of modest means just wanting to create some certainty for themselves, and so they can plan for the future and feel more confident planning. And so the question you asked was, what is a prenuptial agreement? So it's a contract, it's a formal contract entered before the marriage or the civil partnership. Each one is tailored to the couple's individual circumstances, and what it does is just detail the ownership of capital assets. So the assets we've been talking about: properties, bank accounts, savings, business interests, pensions, and inherited assets and pre-acquired assets, and how it will be divided on divorce. And we can also talk about whether or not there would be any spousal maintenance on divorce. The reasons, again, we've touched on: protecting inherited wealth, also safeguarding future inheritance, protecting assets brought into the marriage. Other clients had recently wanted to make sure they retained control of businesses, and parties marrying for a second time want to protect themselves. They want to protect children from previous relationships. We can have protection from being held liable for outstanding debts. And overall, people, as I say, just want peace of mind.
Absolutely. How thick is that document usually? Because sometimes, again, movies you see like whole these like wealthy families like slap on the table like this huge
they we try and keep them manageable, not quite that, but I have received from other sisters ones that are fairly weighted, but no, we try and keep them, as I say, manageable and kind of fairly accessible for both parties to consider.
Can they still be changed after you draft them, or once it's sort of stamped and both parties are happy and witnessed?
Yeah, good question. So, I mean, they can be. There's normally been a bit of to and froing, and they've incurred legal expense in getting them done. So I haven't actually had anyone telling me they want to change the terms kind of shortly after agreeing them. But often there will be review periods built into the agreement. So, for example, on the birth or adoption of a child, or every 10 years or something like that. So they can be reviewed if both parties agree, in writing to change the terms. They can be, yes.
Great. And even if you're married afterwards, you can still change your prenup. Is that correct?
Yeah, if you're both in agreement and you both put it in writing, you could get a post-nuptial agreement that changes the terms of the prenuptial agreement.
Oh, brilliant! Which gives us a good segue to the next one, a post-nuptial.
It does. But
right?
Can I just actually what we've not touched on, which I usually have questions on from people, so I'll preempt that now, is people say, but are they legally binding? And the answer is, in some countries, yes. In England, they're not automatically enforceable because that would require new legislation, and I don't think this government or any government is going to have time for that anytime soon. So they are not automatically enforceable. But if they were ever litigated, then the judge would consider them a factor and weigh up its importance. But what the case law says basically is they are highly likely to be followed as long as each party entered into it with a full appreciation of the implications and without any pressure. There was a major case in 2010 that really promoted prenups, and since then, increasingly, the courts are following them, assuming that the basic safeguards have been met, like financial disclosure, no undue pressure, they're broadly reasonable and they don't prejudice any children. It's helpful for both parties to have legal advice because then neither can say they didn't appreciate the implications of the agreement. And we try and get them signed 28 days before the wedding. That's the Law Commission guidance. Now, if we don't, it doesn't matter. It doesn't mean that the terms of the prenup won't be upheld, but it just helps to show that no one was pressured into signing the terms.
Yeah, brilliant. And actually, I was trying to ask this question earlier as well. So advantages, disadvantages, right? Obviously, I just feel like a no-brainer to have a prenup, right? Because it's a fair document, right? It kind of goes back to covering the previous topic, right? Like about premarital assets, right? Inherited assets. These are the terms that you can actually put into the prenup, right? Which is fair, right?
That's what most clients want when they come to me asking for a prenuptial agreement or to discuss whether or not they should have one. It's because they've built up, they're maybe marrying later in life, they've built up significant assets, built up a business, whatever it is, and want to just ring fence that. Or they have received or know they're about to receive significant inheritance. So that's they're very kind of standard and popular reasons for having prenuptial agreements.
So what are the disadvantages of a prenup then?
Okay, the status, I suppose, they're not legally binding, but then there's nothing we can do about that. And I'd say they're the best in this country that you're going to get. And as a case law, increasingly indicates they will be upheld. We are crystal ball gazing to some extent because we don't know what the family situation is going to be if they were to divorce in 10, 20, 30 years. There's the vulnerability of the economically weaker party. So we do need to make sure that broadly the agreement is fair. And I guess a lot of people would say, well, it's unromantic. But then I see the flip side of it. And I think, well, they help minimize acrimony on divorce. They improve communications on divorce. And they're less, you're going to spend less money litigating in all likelihood if you have one of these and you subsequently end up getting divorced. So I think they're the main disadvantages I can think of.
Yeah, but in a way, I just feel like from a personal perspective too. I mean, if you've been together with somebody for the last, since you were like in your childhood, you met many doing university, there is that kind of, trust already, right?
Yeah.
And maybe you don't need that document. But then most modern relationships are not like that, right? You've met each other like, whilst you were adults, perhaps one party has got, more assets than the other party, right? And it's always going to be in your head a little bit that, is the other party in this for the money? And I think just that document will give you that reassurance, just a little bit, again, fully fair, it's fully fair, right? That we can just kind of safely go into this marriage without worrying about the money or the assets, how they're going to be split, because that's going to be fair. Everyone's going to be taken care of. We just worry about life, children, and love.
Yeah. And as I
Right.
say to people, we draw up these agreements and hope they'll be put at the bottom of a drawer, never to see the light of day again. But it's an insurance policy.
Exactly. And that's how insurance works, right? If if you have it, you're probably never going to use it. If you don't have it, then
You might regret it.
No commode. So now I'm going on to the post-nuptial agreements. So post-nups, I've actually, before coming into this financial planning, I've never heard of them before. I mean, how does that work? Post-nups.
Post-nups, they are the same as prenups, but you enter them after you're married. So, for example, if you previously separated from your spouse, decide to get back together, but feel uncertain about it, you might want a post-nuptial agreement. If you didn't have time to enter a prenuptial agreement or didn't think about entering into one, you can do it after you're married. And I think we touched on it before. If you sign a prenup very shortly before the wedding, you can follow up with a post-nuptial agreement. Recently, I've had one where it wasn't my client, that the spouse received an very large unexpected inheritance during the marriage, and her parents had wanted the couple to have a post-nuptial agreement. And my client, who was a financially weak party in this situation, said, absolutely fine, I wasn't expecting this anyway. I'm happy to sign up to this, which means she can ring fence that unexpected inheritance.
Mm. And, I guess that's a good sort of, topic, because how do you approach, whilst already in a marriage, a topic of a post-nuptial agreement? Because, whilst a prenup can sound quite unromantic, a post-nup sounds even more unromantic, doesn't it?
Yes, I take your point on that. If it's an unexpected inheritance or windfall, then sometimes you see that the families who are giving that money or the assets, or if not insist on it, highly encourage it. So the person requesting the post-nuptial agreement is saying, my family wants to give us this, but on the basis that we have a post-nuptial agreement. So that sometimes happens like that. Other cases I've had, the couple have talked about a prenup and never got round to it, so it's not been a shock when a post-nuptial, they thought, oh, we'll just push that back and do it after we're married. The risk, I suppose, then is to the financially stronger party. If they marry and their spouse says, well, actually, I don't want to sign one now, there's nothing they can do to change the fact they're married and they don't have a post-nuptial agreement or a prenuptial agreement. But you think it might be awkward, but actually the clients I've had wanting them have been fairly pragmatic about it. They've had a conversation and both kind of happily, or at least willingly decided to progress.
Absolutely. And actually, one question that arose earlier, so you said that in your case, right, you represented the financially weaker side of the marriage, right? So do you require two solicitors, for each side of the
Yes.
For the husband and the wife, or husband and husband, both relationship?
Yes, they will get independent legal advice from separate solicitors and separate firms, and so there's no conflict of interest, and so each will have advice based on their respective best interests. So, obviously the stronger financial party will be advised to enter into these agreements, and often the weaker financial party will be told, well, it's not necessarily in your best financial interest, but there is going to be fair provision. And usually people say, yes, actually, I'm more than happy to, as long as I'm provided for. Yeah,
because hopefully they'll still be better off than before, but it just gives both parties a bit more certainty, and then go through a traumatic experience of going to trial, going to court about division of assets.
Exactly, and they know they may get less than a court would award, but most people, when out to the financially weaker side, they say, well, as long as I'm provided for, I don't actually feel the need to bring the other person, you know, my spouse, to be inheritance or pre-acquired assets into the picture, as long as they are fairly provided for.
Yeah, absolutely. And then from a legal perspective, legal status perspective, is it the same thing as a prenup, or is there any difference?
Sorry, I didn't hear. From a legal...
From a legal perspective, like legal status perspective,
yep.
right? Is it the same, treated the same way?
Yes, exactly. Same as a prenuptial agreement. We'd want the same safeguards in place, apart from obviously start having a time limit to sign, because once you're married, sign it whenever. But in terms of financial disclosure, the independent legal advice, it being broadly fair, providing for children, etc., we want to make sure that's in place, so there's less chance of it ever being challenged successfully.
Yeah, brilliant. And I presume, like, you know, again, advantages, disadvantages, similar to the prenups, right? You know, in terms of, right? Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. I'd say they're pretty much the same document, and same advantages and disadvantages.
Yeah, just different stages, you know, before marriage and after.
Exactly.
I did think that this was quite interesting, that you can have both a prenup and a postnup, right? If you make, like, you know, if it was like quite a last minute decision, right? You know, you can have a prenup finalized before, but if there's any changes, you can have the view of having another document in place once it's done, right? So
yeah, but as I say, most people, because they've thought kind of long and hard about what they want to be included, and have taken advice and have negotiated, in part, they're content with what they sign up to.
Yeah, absolutely. So, and you know, and now, what are the, you know, from my perspective, from a financial planning point of view, right, what are some of the financial considerations for pre and post-nuptial agreements, right? And all of these points are, you know, based on real experiences with clients. So I think, first of all, right, so before going into this kind of, you know, agreement, right, you need to kind of have an honest conversation with each other, right? So you should know each other's assets. Otherwise, you know, it's just I mean, again, it probably wouldn't even work in the end if it turns out that one party did not know what the other party actually had, right? Because that would make the document unfair in the eyes of the court. So know what each other actually has. So, and similar in a divorce case, right? So, you know, get the right valuations for the right type of assets. Properties, stocks and shares are easy to value, but what about businesses, right? So it might be, you know, it might just be sensible to know where the business shares actually, like, you know, are from, you know, what might be the valuation. But speaking of that, I mean, Joe, do you actually need to put down exact asset details in a prenup, or, you know, how is that determined?
So in a prenuptial agreement and a postnuptial agreement, it can be summary financial disclosure. Some people may want to provide more detail, but it doesn't have to be. It can be summary. So as long as each party has a kind of a broad idea of what the other has.
Yes.
In a divorce, it needs to be more detailed. Most people make financial disclosure by way of Form E. You mentioned that before, which is a long financial disclosure form. And in that, you need to disclose all assets worldwide which you own or in which you have an interest. And your spouse would do the same, and you'd exchange disclosure.
Yeah. And you know, and I think the importance of, like, you know, knowing the assets is also, like, again, similar to a divorce, the tax implications of different assets, right? So again, know, you know, what the taxation of, say, a property versus a pension versus, you know, a business property, what's called like a business shares, business relief qualifying shares, essentially, right? And actually, based on the level of assets, and this is like one of the biggest questions I always get asked by, you know, couples considering like a prenup, is actually wealth protection and risk management. And what do I mean by that? Actually, life insurance, right? So if we're entering into like an agreement, and there's, again, oftentimes these agreements are, you know, made for couples who are, you know, whereby one party, you know, is financially stronger, one party is financially weaker, right? So in that case, you know, there needs to be a lot of protection in place, you know, for the financially strong party, because hopefully we'll never get to use that document, but so is insurance, right? So you have to like really ensure the future earning power of that financially stronger person, so that when something happens to them, right, that the other party is actually protected. And there is various types of insurance available to, you know, both on a lump sum basis or like an income for life, right? It's just, again, basic risk management, right? So again, all this stuff, you know, and I think Joe put it really like in the right way. It's just an insurance policy, right? Hopefully we'll never get to use it, right? But if we do, there is something in place.
Do you get a lot of inquiries when people are about to embark on big life events like marriage? Do they come to you and say, how, what should we do? What's best?
Yeah, absolutely. And, especially when there's debt involved, right? So they have, they might have a mortgage together, right? So, or even like, again, under one, if the mortgage is under one person's name, so, it's always about, right, something happened to the party, right? What we need to get some insurance in place, right, to actually pay off the debt. I don't want to, sort of marry into debt, right?
Yeah.
And then, if there are children and then involved, right? Then of course, you would want to have a way to take care of them if one party is unable to work, right? So, I mean, insurance doesn't just have to involve death. It could be a critical illness. It could just be like a normal sort of long-term illness whereby, one party, can't work and be the breadwinner, right? So, and again, how in a breadwinner homemaker household, right? If something happens to the breadwinner, right, you just need to make sure that the homemaker will have enough resources to actually, make the home. Which is again, like actually retirement planning is something quite big as well. I actually get asked this, a few times. So after I sign a prenup, can I get the financial security that I'll be taken care of, right? And this again applies especially for sort of the homemaker roles of the household, right? So if I sign this document, right, if something, if we were to ever get into a divorce and this is enforced, right, will I be able to afford our lifestyle, right? Can I take care of the kids a couple of days a week? Can I actually afford my own lifestyle without the other party? So we kind of like do a long-term projection, right? So to make sure like sort of once everybody's happy with the sort of, what the splits are in the prenuptial agreement or post-nuptial agreement, right? We can then actually do like a financial simulation, say that, okay, in case this is actually activated, right? If you live to 100 years old, right, you are still going to have enough money based on the value of those things that you're going to get, right? So that's your share of the house, that's your share of the pension, your share of the whatsoever, right? Based on the prenup, post-nup, you're going to be fine, financially independent, right? But if there is a shortfall, right, then we kind of go back to the, I guess, the negotiation table saying that, look, I've decided to make the home, right? But if something ever were to happen, I don't think I can actually live to 100 and be fine with money. I'll probably run out of money before I run out of life, which is probably not what you want to make either. So we need a bit more money, right? And then lastly, estate planning, actually similar in divorce case, right? So, right, what are the tax implications, of different types of assets, and how are things going to be divided? Because certain assets are tax efficient, like from an inheritance tax perspective. So from an estate planning perspective, like business relief qualifying shares, like your pensions, right? Other like things such as property, cash, right? They're not very inheritance tax friendly. So it's kind of these considerations that, to kind of think about for these agreements. Now, move on to the last part of the, of our, little lovely discussion, cohabitation agreements. Tell us, what is a cohabitation agreement? Joe.
So it is a contract between people who live together who are not married. We need to be really, really clear. There's no such thing as a common law spouse. That's kind of Daily Mail speak. You're either married or you're not in terms of what happens, legally, and what happens when you split up. So if you separate and you're a cohabiting couple, you're not married, then the arrangements are not based on family law at all. They're based on land law and contract law. And currently, and this may change if the local government gets in, but there is currently no such protection for cohabitees as there is if you're married and then divorcing. So all claims are dealt with as a strict matter of property law. So if either of you own an asset, it's yours unless the other person can justify some kind of proprietary right to it. So it's really, really important to get a deed of trust, for example, drawn up. And if you're going to buy a property, be clear what shares, how is this property going to be held? What you don't want is the other person trying to claim a resulting trust, so a beneficial trust because they've contributed money to the property, or a constructive trust, so saying, well, we intended that I would have a beneficial interest, and trying to ask the court to infer that agreement and to change, to adjust the beneficial interest. You want to mitigate against all that uncertainty and draw up a cohabitation agreement. And that agreement can be entered into before you start cohabiting, after you've started cohabiting, and it sets out, how you will manage your finances during the relationship and what would happen after you split up.
Yeah, brilliant. So basically, like, so because a lot of modern families or couples decide not to really like go into a marriage, and I've seen that increasingly with clients and like also my sort of personal friend circles. So, I guess this document will kind of like solve the issue about a fair division of assets. Could you even say that this is like a prenup, but like without a marriage?
Is it? Kind of, yes. Although you're not needing to think, there's more certainty if you separate not having married. Yeah. Okay, so if you're divorcing, there's so much uncertainty because the court has this wide discretion. Less so if you're cohabiting, but you still want to make sure that you're both on the same page as to what would happen with the assets if you split up, particularly what interests you have in the property, so your family home, and how it's going to be divided.
Right. So I guess it's more the softer aspect, right? So less maybe financial divisions, but like more, like the relationship. I don't know.
Yeah, it can deal. I've had these agreements detailing all sorts of things. If they were to split up, how long one would have to remain in the house, when they would leave, all the practicalities, but also, I suppose most importantly, is just to set down clearly what the intentions are with respect to the assets. So neither can try and claim an interest later on that they don't have, or that it was never intended they have.
So once they do decide to get married, does the cohabitation agreement still have a place, or is it just basically like, right, that's an agreement in the past?
Yes, and if you were to get married, still wanted that kind of certainty, you would need to have a nuptial agreement.
Yeah, brilliant.
Because then they're drafted on the basis that family law would deal with the divorce rather than property and contract law, which is the law that would deal with separating cohabitees.
Absolutely. So, I mean, on that point, right, cohabitation agreements, again, this is where a matter of like, couples deciding not to really get married. So we have to really look at financial planning on a sort of individual basis, right? We can't just kind of like, group their assets together and say like, this is like sort of planning for the unit. So we look at, what are the goals for each individual partners in this, right? So just ensure that both parties have a path to financial independence, right? So make sure they have enough assets that's accessible, right? Maximize their ISA allowances, but also look at their own pensions, right? There will be no pension sharing orders in this kind of case.
Correct.
It really is just kind of like, looking at your own situation, you're looking at your own goals, right? Making sure you're going to be independently financially independent. Oh, wow. And then it's a clear sort of education about what asset ownership and division, right? So most sort of married couples buy a property on a joint tenancy basis, right? But in this case, if you decide not to get married and go through this route, right, probably a tenancy in common is a more effective way to buy a property together, right? And so also like, if you have cash, do you have a joint bank account? Do you have individual bank accounts? These are all kind of, decisions to make. And having some professional advice about that, is very helpful. Similar to, again, the prenups and post-nups, right? Having a good risk management, that's protections in place is very important, right? So you just, again, make sure if one party, goes into long-term illness or something, the worst would happen to them, that the other party is taken care of, right? So to be clear, right, you can have a life insurance and then have the beneficiary to be anybody. It doesn't have to be just your family. So whether you're not married or not doesn't really matter in terms of, the life from a life insurance perspective.
Yeah.
Tax implications as well. Again, if you don't get married, there's a lot of these, tax reliefs that's not available. Things such as interspousal reliefs, both from an inheritance tax perspective, from a capital gains tax perspective, right, will not be available. So what can you do? Again, maximize whatever you can do. Maximize your ISAs, maximize your pensions, right? These things you will not lose, right? It's just essentially some interspousal exemptions that you won't be able to access. Debt management, right? So again, right, it's a sort of like, I don't know actually, Joe, if that can be part of the cohabitation agreement, how debt is managed. So if one party, repays the mortgage, how does the other party contribute towards that? But then how is the house going to be split? I mean, is that everything that you can do in a cohabitation agreement?
Yeah, we would talk about who's paying the deposit. Sometimes, for example, one party will pay the deposit because they've received inheritance, but the other one may have a large earning capacity and say be paying more of the mortgage. So we look at all of that, and work out what they want to happen long term. And just picking up on a point you touched on a moment ago, you talked about when people buy the property as tenants in common rather than joint tenants. So tenants in common is where each party owns a specified share of the property, be it 50-50 or another percentage. If one of those parties was to die, their share would pass under the terms of their will. And so, just to pick on the point, it's really important that if you're buying a property, it's important anyway, but if you're buying a property that way, you really must have a will, because if you were to die, you want it to be crystal clear who your share of property is passing to.
I see. Really good point. Really good point. And really, lastly, like about children, right? So some couples decide to never get married, get a cohabitation agreement in place, and then have children, right? So again, just make sure you're maximizing all the, financial, savings products available for your children. That's your junior ISAs, right? That's your children's pensions, high interest, children's accounts that banks offer, right? So that doesn't really affect anything, but just make sure like both parties put in an equal way, or whichever you tend to agree with, in that agreement, right? So,
yes, I should say you can't prejudice the rights of children. So, for example, whether the parents are married or unmarried, if they split up and the child is based more with one parent than the other, then that other parent would need to pay child maintenance. If you're getting divorced, the court looks at how the child should be provided for, primarily with housing. And actually, one point on the cohabitation front is if you do have children together, the party they're based with, if they can't afford housing, might be able to make a claim for housing on the child's behalf, and maybe that housing would then revert to the payer when the child becomes an adult. So there are complicating factors, but I think we've outlined the basic position in law, and that's the starting point people need to consider.
Absolutely. Wow. The English court don't make it simple, do they? Brilliant. So, I mean, that's it really, for the webinar. So, I think we just want to leave the sort of questions and Q&A section open for a couple of minutes. And, just ask us anything. I know we've talked about a lot. We've pretty much covered some big topics in family law. So yeah, and feel free to, again, you can see our email contact details on the left-hand side. So either, get in touch with Joe if you have a query, get in touch with me if you have a query. And we do have actually one question here from Amy. Does the post-nup supersede whatever it's in the earlier prenup, just for general knowledge?
Sorry, I can't see these questions, so it's good you read it out. So it does what's in the post. Yes, so often what will happen is the post-nuptial agreement will reflect the terms of the pre-nuptial agreement, if there is one. People usually use it as a belts and braces approach. But if for any reason you want to change the terms of the pre-nuptial agreement, and it is agreed between both of you, you can't do it unilaterally. But if it's agreed between both of you, yes, you can change those terms in a post-nuptial agreement.
Okay, brilliant. So again, yeah, fine. So you can have both, right? It doesn't really it's not like, for example, the cohabitation agreement whereby if you get married, then cohabitation doesn't exist anymore. It just kind of it's another building block on top of a foundation. Yeah. Let's see. Okay, we got one actually good question. How much will a prenup cost?
So it does vary because most listers do not do these on a fixed rate, because some will take far less time than others. So they usually, I'd say my average one is between £3,000 and £5,000 plus VAT, but they can be less if it's really simple and very minimal negotiations, or they could be more if there's really complex assets and there's not so much agreement on how the terms, are on the terms. So that's not a definitive answer. I'm sorry, but I don't think I can give a definitive answer. What normally happens is once I've had more of a chat with people about their circumstances, then I'm able to give a better steer as to what I think it's going to cost. But as I say, my average is about £3,000 to £5,000 plus VAT.
Yeah, I mean, look, I mean, if it's something very simple, there's, a couple of assets, it's just, something like, like a simple insurance and everybody's really happy, then it doesn't really take a lot of time. So it should be, again, quite cost effective. But then if there's a lot of going back and forth, and then getting other people involved, to value different things, right? Of course, it can be a bit more expensive, right? But,
yeah,
it's always about the case.
Exactly. And sometimes we need to, if there's international dimensions, we need to consult with foreign lawyers and decide which jurisdiction's best, etc., etc. So that can add to, the time we need to spend on a document.
Yeah, great. That's brilliant. So, yeah, I think you're actually already running a bit over time. But again, thank you for everybody, right? That attends this webinar. There will be a recording available for everyone that's attended, so you can recap about what we talked about. Yeah, we look forward to seeing you guys soon
from you.
in the next series and hearing from you.
It's one for you. Sorry, Chenji, a question has just popped up on my screen that I can see. I don't know if you can see it as well. This is one for you though. Would you recommend life insurance?
Well, I think, life insurance is one of those things. I mean, the question, that we always say is depends on, because we can't just generally advise people to get it. But if you have a debt, if you have children, right, if you have, again, that's already like a precondition that you definitely should have life insurance. If you're single, no debts, no assets, then maybe it's not really worth the cost. But again, it depends on the personal situation. Again, happy to have a chat and give you a couple of options. So please do get in touch. But yeah, thank you to everybody, and hope you have a nice rest of February. I'm looking forward to the next webinar. Thank you, Joe.
Thank you. Thanks, Chenji. Bye.
Great. Bye-bye. Bye-bye.